All right, I see a couple folks are still trickling in, but I think we go ahead and get started here. So thanks again, everybody. Welcome to Tevora's webinar, California Consumer Privacy Act, Lessons Learned in 2020 and Predictions for 2021. My name is Matt Fullerton, and I'm an account manager with Tevora. Today, however, we'll be hearing from Adorial Betheshu, Senior Information Security Consultant with Tevora, as well as Scott Giordano, VP and Senior Counsel Privacy and Compliance at Spirion. If there are any questions, please use the questions function there in GoToMeeting, and we will address those as we go. Before we get going here, just a little background on Tevora. We're a management consultancy. We focus entirely on information security, on compliance, and on enterprise risk management. We offer a huge range of services from security assessments and penetration tests to solution selection and implementation. And of course, we have a fully dedicated privacy practice for all the regional privacy regulations. That's Adorial's team here at Tevora. We also support SOC 1 through 3, and we have a full healthcare practice providing HIPAA, HITRUST, and ISO services. Tevora is also certified by the PCI Council, where we are both a qualified security assessor and a PCI forensic investigator. We've been in business for nearly 18 years, privately owned that time, with no outside investment, no outside influence. And we work with companies of all sizes, all the way from the startups to the Fortune 500s and above. So that's just a little bit on who we are here at Tevora. Adorial, Scott, I'll turn it over to you to take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me on your webcast today.
I'm sorry, Scott, just one question came in from the audience already. We are going to be recording this presentation, so that will be available after the session today.
Excellent. Okay, that's fine. So again, thank you for having me on your webcast. Delightful to be here. Scott Giordano, I am our Senior Counsel for Privacy and Compliance at Spirion, and Spirion, we are a tech firm. So we are exclusively a tech firm. We are the leading tech firm that specializes in data discovery and classification software. So imagine that you are putting together a data inventory for all the sensitive data within your environment. Our technology, the technology you're going to use to go and discover that information wherever it might be. Could be in a cloud, could be behind your firewall, structured, unstructured. If it's sensitive, we'll find it. Adorial, do you want to give you a little background before we continue?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Scott. So my name is Adorial Betheshu. I work with / head out the privacy team at Tevora. I spent the pretty much bulk of my 2.5 years at Tevora working with various companies and clients to build out privacy programs from the most mature phases to even intro phases, privacy impact assessments, building out policies and implementation. And even going into the certification side as far as like ISO and everything. So, so that's essentially my the bulk of my work has just been helping companies reach compliance with CCPA, GDPR, and the many other international privacy laws that people have to be aware of.
Wonderful. All right. Well, in that case, then let's get started. And I do want to ask the audience, if you have questions, send them in. We love getting questions throughout our discussion here. So. If you leave with nothing else, a couple things. One, CCPA lawsuits continue to roll in. There's been at least 40 since the beginning of the year, probably a lot more around there floating around that I don't know about, but at least 40. The California Privacy Rights Act, CPRA, or as I call it, CCPA 2.0, is now law. And I'll have a future webinar with Tevora on this subject, but for now, I will have some predictions for 2021 that I'll talk about at the end of our presentation about what the future looks like and how this has changed everything. So for today, there's so much that we could talk about. I'm going to talk about 5 main issues here. One is not making promises you can't keep. The other one is getting consent for using someone's personal data. Integrated InfoSec throughout your entire life cycle of whether it's a product or a service. And understand that there's so much more to personal information than just a name or number, and that'll touch upon the CPRA as well. And then detection and response. I have a lot of respect for people that do this and do it full time, and it's its own discipline. So we'll be talking about that as well. And then of course, the NIST privacy framework has excellent potential to resolve these issues. I'm a big fan of the privacy framework and the CSF, so we'll touch upon those if time permits. So first up, don't make promises that you can't keep. So what do I mean by that? Organizations so often on their websites make all of these promises as to what they do vis-a-vis privacy and security, and they're not certain that they can keep those promises. And as a result, when things go south, those things wind up as Exhibit A in the courtroom. And Exhibit A for our presentation here is Contra v. Zoom. So this is the Zoom that you and I likely have been using for the last 8 or 9 months. Voluntarily or involuntarily. And the issue here is with Zoom, and by the way, this is at least one of 8 lawsuits filed against Zoom just in the Northern District of California. So there's likely more out there, or these are just the ones I found there. And so what happened? One thing is that Zoom said all kinds of things about encryption that were not true. And we'll dig a little deeper into that in a minute. Also, Zoom's China operations had access to North American meetings. So in principle, if the Chinese government asked for access to those meetings live or recorded, they could have gotten that access, those meeting times and meeting minutes. Also, Zoom's recordings can be found on unprotected servers on the dark web, which was a bit of an embarrassment. And so it may be that there are Zoom recordings of yours that are floating around out there. So these are all allegations by Contra and others as well. So let's dig a little deeper into this by what I mean by don't make promises you can't keep. So Zoom put on their website that they use end-to-end encryption for all meetings and role-based use of security so that people can meet securely. They said, we take security seriously and are proud of it. We're committed to protecting your privacy. We design policies to protect your information, etc. So, and my favorite, places security and privacy at the highest priority in the lifecycle operations. Okay, so now you've just set the bar very high and really set yourself up for failure. And so then when the lawsuits rolled in, what happened is that someone at Zoom mentioned that their definition of end-to-end and endpoint are not the same that are commonly used in the technology industry. So that was definitely a fail. And then the Zoom spokesperson admitted, when we use end-to-end, it's a reference rather to the connection being encrypted from a Zoom endpoint to a Zoom endpoint. In other words, within their own domain. That end-to-end is a pretty short end-to-end. So yeah, that did not work out very well. Here's another case. This is Sheth v. Ring. This is the Ring security doorbell or security camera, whatever you want to call it, that again, many of us either own or at least we're all familiar with. And you probably are apprised of the many problems that this has had. And in fact, there's at least 5 lawsuits filed against Ring that I'm aware of. There's likely more. So here's the issue here. I know some of the lawsuits allege that there was security failures and break-ins and bad people breaking into networks and terrorizing people. This particular lawsuit didn't even allege anyone broke in. It's just that essentially Ring said that they're maintaining, administrative, technical, physical safeguards, etc. But in reality, it failed to imply or implement rather just entirely common and basic cybersecurity measures to protect against unauthorized access. So that was bad. And this is a great example. And again, you've heard the stories almost certainly in the news about issues with Ring. So great example why you don't make comments or promises that you don't know that you can keep. So on your organization's task list, review your organization's privacy policy. And really that's the wrong word. It's a privacy statement that is publicly facing. Ask yourself, are there unsupported or unsupportable claims? And then also review the statements that are in your apps, because this is another opportunity to get things wrong. And are you being clear as to what information, personal information is being used and where it's being sent? More on that in a couple other slides. And finally, and this is my favorite, don't try to impress the public with jargon. It will likely backfire. I've seen just some absurd statements like, we use 2056-bit elliptical key encryption. Whenever you see that, that is just inviting trouble to say, wow, we're really great. And then when things aren't really great, then this winds up as Exhibit A. Matt, I'm going to take a pause here. Questions or comments about this?
Nothing from the audience so far, Scott. I think you're doing a great job.
Okay, all right, then we will roll on. Next up is always get informed consent for using and sharing personal information. So let's talk about informed consent. CCPA doesn't really do a good job of talking about consent in depth. GDPR does, so I'm going to just borrow from them just for a moment. So when they talk about the consent of a data subject, meaning a consumer in our parlance, it means any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication by the data subject that they wish to do a certain thing, whatever it is, in this case, processing of personal data. Okay, so we have some baseline to work from, and CCPA was in some cases borrowed from GDPR. So let's go back to Condrat, and then I'll dig into another lawsuit we haven't talked about yet. So under Condrat v. Zoom, they allege, again, these are all allegations, but they allege that the Zoom mobile app was sending customer PI to Facebook without authorization, even if the customer didn't have a Facebook account. That's remarkable, folks. And then also Zoom would connect to Facebook's Graph API automatically whenever you open the app. And Graph, by the way, for those that you don't know, it's the main mechanism that you get data in and out of Facebook. And if you're familiar with the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, the Cambridge Analytica used Graph extensively in their malfeasance. So the net of it is whether it's an app or it's anything else, make sure that you're getting permission to use personal data. Burke v. Clearview AI, this is probably going to be the biggest case of next year. We've already seen Clearview having lost some court motions, and we suspect this is going to be big in 2021. So Clearview AI, in a nutshell, this is a company, I'm not making this up, it's a company that went out and scraped thousands of websites, including LinkedIn and Facebook and all those, grabbed images of you and me and everyone else, and then connected that using software to identify everyone, and then sold those images to law enforcement and to some unsavory governments overseas. So this, you would think this is, how could they do that? But unfortunately, as it stands under US law, it's a little bit of a gray area. And so in terms of notice, no one received any notice and certainly didn't consent to doing this. So this is going to be probably the big case, in my view, of privacy going into 2021 and maybe 2022. We'll see whether this settles. There's multiple lawsuits against Clearview AI. Okay, go back to Sheffy Ring for just a moment. So, because again, this is the issue with apps. Investigation of the Ring app found it was packed with third-party trackers, sending out customer PII, again, without consent. And so the idea here is that allegedly Ring failed here because you're sharing customer information with third party without their consent, and therefore you're delivering a product that's less useful. I mean, think about a security system, and that's essentially what Ring is. I mean, it's a camera, it probably does other things I don't know about, but the idea behind it, it's a security system, and that if all and sundry can break into it, or if they're sharing, Ring is sharing your information with people without your permission, it probably defeats the purpose largely of having a security system. So on your task list, identify with some precision what personal information you're processing, what's the purpose, and with whom you're sharing it. And emphasize the underlying purpose. In the Equifax case, when they got fined the first time, they've gotten fined again, but on the first time, one of the reasons they got fined by the British Information Commissioner's Office was because they had data on their servers. They didn't even know why they had it in the first place. And if you don't know why you have it, that's a big negative, to say the least. Also, is the information contained in the notice that's every point of collection. So say, for example, that you've got a website, and you've got your notice on the website, but you also have an app, but you haven't put any consent information on the app or any notice information on the app saying, hey, by the way, this collection, whatever it is subject to our privacy policy, or whatever it might be. Typically, you'll see that if you're plugging in an email address to get a newsletter, then you'll get an email or a little link that'll say this, we won't share your information, et cetera, et cetera. That's really where it's got to be at every point of collection. Also, if you wish to use personal information for a new purpose, do you have a mechanism for getting consent? On the original version of the CCPA regulations, you had to go back and get consent if you changed the purpose for why you're processing data. That was pulled back at the very last possible second, but I suspect it's going to make a return. That's only how things work with GDPR. So net of it is that if you're going to change reasons why you're processing, and you're processing personal data for something else, there's a good chance that you're going to have to go back and get consent at some point. Also, be wary of this one checkbox to rule them all consent mechanism. Google got really slammed for this by the French version of the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. It's called the CNIL. And what happened is that Google had about 20 different processes they were doing with personal data. They had one checkbox to consent to everything. And the CNIL essentially said, sorry, that doesn't give people really a choice because they don't know what they're consenting to. And writing consent policies or consent notices are tough because you don't want to write them that they're so specific that you have to go back for permission for any change that you do, but you don't want to make them so general that they're worthless. So it's a bit of a challenge in how you construct those. Now I'm going to again do something that you do throughout the service cycle, and that comes through litigation with CCPA. So we'll go back to Kathy for just a moment. So this allegation is that Ring doesn't require against Ring also mentioned that breaking into a Ring account can grant access to intimate private parts. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have very well thought out and developed Ring cams throughout their house. They've got the doorbell, they've probably got it elsewhere. And the thing is that if that's left open for all and sundry, then you've defeated the purpose of a security system, and now it becomes a liability and not an asset. So on your task list, really identify the process you have in place for baking security into your SDLC. And I'm using SDLC, but it could be just a service that you've developed. Maybe it's a web-based service that you're doing, but there's still plenty of opportunities for abuse. You know, how could you bake in those ideas? The document to your right, okay, came out about 6 months ago. So this is for mitigating vulnerabilities in the SDLC. This is published by NIST. I'm sure those of you on the presentation today are big fans of NIST. There's just endless good stuff that comes out of NIST. So I highly recommend taking a look at this. If you are an aficionado of the CSC Top 20, Control 18, which is application security software or application software security, has particular relevance, do have a look at that, even if you haven't formally adopted the top 20. I love the CSC top 20 as well. It's really good.
Scott, while you were talking there, the circuit board lit up. So we've got a few questions here.
Tell me.
Under CCPA, can you explain what type of consent is acceptable when it comes to using APIs, implied or explicit?
Well, that's a great question. Right now, because the consent, there's no jurisprudence on the consent. Okay. Unfortunately, the one thing we had that they pulled out the last minute was telling you about getting consent for new uses. At this point, there's only really two main consent pieces, and it's really negative consent. It's opt-out consent. So one is to tell companies don't sell my information, so it's opt-out consent. Other one is to tell recipients of information they've already gotten not to use it. That's your two negatives. So can you do that implicitly or explicitly via an API? Based on what I know now, you can do it either way, as long as you're giving the end user the opportunity to say, no, you can't transfer my data, or no, you can't use it if you already have it. That's what's crucial, whether it's through an API or something else, whether it's implicit or explicit, as long as you have that chance, you're good to go at this point.
Okay, wonderful. And along the same lines of consent, what is happening with default on consent, and how is that playing out in reality in CCPA?
Well, here's the problem. When you say a default on, meaning it's opt out. It's completely the opposite of how Europe does it, where it's opt-in only. You have to approve of something, you have to consent of something before they use it. Again, there are exceptions. We'll talk about those later, but net of it is that here in the US, the reason why it's opt-out consent or it's basically automatically on consent, if you want to think of it that way, is allegedly for constitutional reasons. And I'm dubious, but I'm going to share this argument with you, that it's going to violate what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause of the US Constitution if we require people to opt in to consent to something versus opting out, because it's going to create a constraint of trade. I don't buy it. And I've heard other attorneys allege this. I respectfully disagree. So in terms legally, yes, it's absolutely the standard is always on consent, if you will, or default on consent. I think it's a bad idea, but I can see why we got to where we are. So the net of it is that, yes, we have to deal with this, but I would still give your customers an opportunity to opt out and make sure that they know about it. At least for California consumers, you can decide whether you want all your consumers to have that.
Excellent, thanks for that analysis. The
Sure.
final question here is, we have a follow-up on that.
Yeah, sure.
So does that mean in certain cases where, say, there's a lack of opt-in consent, there are scenarios where PII can be collected, sold, or disclosed without consent?
Under the GDPR, I'm going to use this analogy, or I'm going to use this analysis is probably a better way to say it. Under GDPR, there are certain things you can do that are based not on consent or on a contract like a e-commerce purchase or something, but on the legitimate interest of the organization. For example, as an employee in the EU, you can't consent to the use of your personal information. It's a legal conundrum. So what you do is you say that as a company, you have a legitimate interest to process their data so that you can send them a paycheck. So it's a bit of a contortion of how you do things legally in the EU. I don't think they should just made a carve out, quite frankly, for employees and been done with it, but put that aside. That is, I think, the ideal model. Unfortunately, here in the US, we are going to be with a default opt-out consent. And that's just what we have to work with for the foreseeable future. I doubt we're going to go to an EU style model. But there are limited cases where you can do things without consent. But in my view, you better know what you're doing, otherwise you're going to get in trouble. And I can do an entire webcast on companies that have gotten that wrong.
Okay, good deal. And finally here, did Prop 24 enhance the get consent again provision?
It did not. This is funny because the get consent provision that was pulled to the last possible second was very GDPR-like, because that's how you have to do things in GDPR. That proposed rule, or proposed regulation, came in after the CPRA went on the ballot. So CPRA really doesn't address that. And like I said, in the future, I'll give you guys a complete presentation on CPRA, but they don't really dig any deeper in consent than otherwise. What they do change, and this is really important, is that now you have a third or a second opt-in consent. In this case, you have to consent to the use of your personal data, not just to the transfer of it. That's huge. Because you think about it, how many companies collect personal data and then use it internally to develop products or services, or to analyze things or do big data or whatever it is the companies do with all your data. Now you can't even use it without permission. And that's a big deal. And that's what part of the core of Prop 24. People have no idea how big this is, how big a change it is. So the net of it is I will do a presentation on that early next year, but it's going to be earth-shaking. It really is how they're going to be doing things.
That's fantastic, Scott. I think the group here will really be excited for that presentation next year. That's everything from the audience right now.
Okay. So let's talk more about personal information. So that there's so much more to personal information than just a name or a social security number. So what do I mean by that? Way back when, we'll say circa 1995, we'll say just as the internet was becoming a thing, you can think about what was the most personal of your personal information. It was maybe a social security number, although we were still using those. In law school, we were still using those. You'd still write those on your, at the top of your page or whatever it is. So it was not quite that personal. And you had a name and address, and your phone number probably was the most personal thing because you didn't want telemarketers bothering you. Fast forward 20 years, think about all the things that are now personal information because they're machine readable. So your IP address, your MAC address, what are called IDFAs, which are advertising identifiers, GPS locations. I mean, everything is just personal information because it's tied back to you. That's the challenge, and let's dig more into that. So we'll go back to Condratt v. Zoom because this is just a great case. So what would happen is that your app would tell things like the model of your phone, time zone, city, the phone carrier, and a unique advertising identifier. And the word unique is important here, meaning it ties back to you. Also IDFA, or identifier for advertisers. They're unique alphanumeric strings, and they tie an individual back to a device. Again, that's bad news because now that is essentially a fingerprint of you, and you'd be shocked at the things that are on your phone. Doesn't matter, Android, Apple, whatever it is, there's so much identifying information on there that you likely have no idea about. This is the challenge that we're facing right now. Burke review, Clearview AI, remarkable. This idea of a face print. So this is biometric information writ large because it's easy to change. Okay, maybe it's not easy to change a social security number, but you can do it in theory. You can change a phone number easily in theory. You can't change your face, not easily anyway. So a face print, that pretty much is something that follows you wherever you go. So guess what happens when bad guys break into Clearview AI if they haven't already? And if I'm an intelligence agency, you can bet I've already broken into this place and taken everything. So they've got all these face prints. Now it's something that you can match with other things. And you can't change biometrics, at least not easily. And this is an issue. The FTC has already said, get consent or recommended they get consent before doing this. In principle, they should be requiring it, but we'll leave that for next year. This is important. Biometrics are particularly toxic. And here we have a company that's basically just done this for the whole population here in the US, if not the world. So go back to Chef v. Ring, more bad news here. So they're sharing things like IP addresses, persistent identifiers, sensor data. You've got things, time zones, device models, etc. And then it's even given to this firm called Mixpanel, and I've not familiar with these guys, but they've got user name, address, Bluetooth information, etc. So the net of it is this: you're getting so much information that end users probably have no idea is being shared, and certainly you're not getting permission to do this, or at least not knowing permission to do it. So it's a big deal.
Scott, what about zip code? Is that considered PII and protected under CCPA?
Zip code per se, in and of itself, the answer is no, but it takes very little to cross-reference a zip code to find someone. Again, I was shocked at how little information. There's a great book that came out a couple of years ago, but it's still very relevant, by Bruce Schneer. It's called Data and Goliath. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. He goes through how all these different scenarios of how easy it is to use about 3 pieces of information to identify someone. So zip code and a couple other things, and you can identify someone. It's that easy. So, and this is the challenge. I get questions from people that say, well, I just have a credit card number and nothing else in this file. And then am I okay for PCI DSS? And I would say, well, maybe for that. But the problem is that do you have any other information that could be cross-referenced in your environment? If you do, then you're defeating the purpose of saying, yeah, we're good on that point, when they can just, bad guys can cross-reference it and find out who someone is anyway. So you have to think a step ahead of the bad guys, and that's the challenge. So it goes back to your task list, which is do a de novo review, a brand new review from ground zero, go through your ecosystem, get an idea of what personal information you have there, or things that can be turned personal, if you will, just by cross-referencing them. If you have a data inventory, time to update it. If you don't, time to create one. And then determine under GDPR whether a DPI, a data protection impact assessment, will be required. And you might say, well, gee, Scott, we don't do business in the EU, or our partners don't do business in the EU. Doesn't matter. The reason why I like this so much is because if you would have been required to do a DPIA, it's a red flag that you may want to add additional controls. And certainly if the DPIA came back and said, hey, you've got unmitigated risk that's a high, essentially a high risk, then you've got a big problem. So I would use that. It's a great tool. There is a working party document called WP248 that you can all download for free, and it walks through how to do a DPIA. I would highly recommend it. Again, even if you're not going to be selling into the EU, it's just great practice.
Hey Scott, I did have one point I wanted to, just going back one slide, I just wanted to like a little further emphasize, because I think you made a good point at the very end to Matt's question, but I think it's a good way to look at it, and what I've told some clients is that, is there enough information in your environment that a profile of an individual can be created? And I think that that's really important when it comes to any kind of anonymization or de-identification. I've definitely seen cases where a de-identified database, for example, that has maybe like a unique customer ID, and then on the side is medical information, demographics, whatever it may be. And you can claim that's de-identified, but if there's another production database with similar access controls with that user ID, and then the name is in there. So I mean, then like what you were saying, if you have access to both, you now have access to the user ID, which then takes you to the other database. You have access to all their medical information. So I think it's really important to, like, especially when you're trying to do any kind of purging, anonymization, whatever it may be, you just really take a step back, look at your overall data inventory and say, do I have enough attributes that could create an individual? And like you said, 3 could probably be enough if you have something like a job title or whatever else it might be. These are all things that are very easy to search up on LinkedIn for anybody who's any nefarious activities or anything. So I just think that that's a very important thing to consider. And then one more thing I wanted to point for the data inventory is just wherever possible, include as many people as you can in the data inventorying process, because you never know what good information you'll get from who in the organization. One data inventorying exercise I did with a client, they believe their scope to be very limited, and then we talked to one individual who told us, oh, by the way, there's this database that's been sitting dormant for several years with lots of card numbers on it. So I think it's just 2 points, I guess, takeaway is just making sure that there's not a profile that can be made of an individual in your organization if you've gone to the effort of anonymizing, and also making sure that everybody's involved in the data inventorying exercise, because everybody interacts with your customers' data. Everybody puts it in different places. They put it on emails, they put it on shared drives. So it's important to get that insight from everywhere.
Absolutely, I completely agree, Matt. And to your point about folks outsmarting themselves because they're de-identifying one database, but then there's another database that a bad guy can cross-reference. Yeah, that just, it defeats the purpose of de-identification. If you've done that effort, you have to do it across everything, or you're going to have to remove access, or really find a way to completely air gap that other database away. Absolutely. Other questions, other comments out there before we roll? And these are great questions.
Yeah, these are great questions. Really appreciate everything from the audience here. Keep them coming.
Okay.
But that is everything for now.
Okay, then let's talk about breach detection and response. I wanted to point out the virtues of breach detection and response as its own subdiscipline of data protection. I think that breach detection and response gets short shrift in the sense that many companies will maybe have a policy and maybe even a plan, but the plan hasn't been drilled. Everyone doesn't know instantaneously who's doing what with whom. If there is a breach, what the thresholds are for whether an event becomes an incident, then becomes a breach, whether something is a breach legally versus perhaps morally. And I'll give you an example. Is ransomware. Let's say that you've got ransomware, because your data has been encrypted and the bad guy sends you a note demanding money. So you've got ransomware. Is that a breach? It's for some people it's a difficult question. For me, it's not. If the integrity of your data has been called into question, then it's a breach. But some folks will argue and say no, it's not, because you can't prove data has been exfiltrated. So I'm not sympathetic to that, but that is an argument. For the Department of Health and Human Services, So for essentially healthcare industry, a breach is, or a ransomware attack is a breach, full stop. And therefore you have to follow all of the high-tech regulations for notifying folks. But this is the kind of stuff that you have to think about in advance, and you have to put enough resources behind it so that it becomes its own sub-discipline of data protection. And specifically, incident response is one sub-discipline because you have people that you need to kick the bad guys out of the network to resolve the issue with. If your information has been encrypted, you know, what do? Do you just go to backups and just dump everything, and then you have that to deal with? Then the incident response, who do you notify? You have to notify your business partners immediately. You have to notify others within 72 hours under GDPR. So there's a lot of substance that you have to do. So it becomes its own sub-discipline. And I'll give you some examples here. First up, under CCPA. CCPA is not a breach notification law. Okay, that's the one misunderstanding. Neither is CPRA for that matter. They're not breach notification laws, and that's because we already have them. So California has had a breach notification law since 2003, surprisingly. So, and there's a story behind that, but the point is that they've already have this, and so you shall disclose a breach in the most expedient time possible and without unreasonable delay. It can't be any clearer than that. You have to do that. Also, there's a separate security regulation that says you shall implement reasonable security procedures and practices that are appropriate to the nature of the information. I've got appropriate to the nature of information because in blue, because that means risk assessment. In fact, whenever you see something that is of this ilk, appropriate to the nature of the information, that is screaming, I must have a risk assessment. Otherwise, if you just start throwing controls into place for whatever reason, maybe because you already paid for them, so you say, oh, these are my controls, but they're not appropriate to the nature because they're not indicated by a risk assessment. When something bad happens, the first thing that's going to happen in litigation is that the opposing side is going to ask for a copy of risk assessment. And if you don't have one, that's going to be pretty bad. So just as a practical matter, CCPA works side by side with security and with breach notification. Go back to Condrat v. Zoom because it's the lawsuit that keeps on giving. So here, back in April, an actor on a popular dark web forum posted links to over 300 compromised Zoom accounts. Security researchers found other dark web places that had over 2,300 compromised Zoom credentials. So the net of this whole thing is that once you find out that there's been a breach, it's time to get the wheels turning, get legal involved, make a determination whether it merits a response. And in this case, I think the answer is likely yes, but you can certainly decide for yourself and then get the gears turning. But this is crucial, and this is something that when these compromises happened, Zoom really should have been on top of it. Here's another, this is probably the best example of how not to do things that I read for CCPA litigation. So this is Hannah Anderson and Salesforce. This allegedly what happened is that the bad guys broke in somewhere between September and November of last year, of 2019. And it allegedly, Hannah Anderson was notified by the FBI. But you see this Keystone Cops reaction where there was not a really solid notification to the public or to the attorneys general of the US, just the whole US, until a month later. And so that was no good. Also, there was no indication that Salesforce notified anyone. It was just at least these are getting allegations from the lawsuit. But the point here is that it's pretty clear there was a dysfunctional process of notifying folks, determining when there's a breach. This is really crazy. Hannah Anderson admits it didn't detect the breach. Salesforce didn't tell them. Law enforcement did, but yet the malware was allegedly removed before the defendants even noticed it, and so it doesn't ring true. And again, I'm not saying that these guys are guilty. All I'm saying is that this is the kind of stuff that you don't want to appear in a lawsuit. So on your task list, have a very distinct incident response and breach notification plan. Review the criteria for determining when an incident is considered a breach. This is super important because, again, of the philosophical issues of is ransomware a breach? And again, you know how I feel about that, but ultimately you have to determine internally whether an incident is a breach or when an incident is a breach, and also whether something that's ransomware related qualifies as that. Also consider too that you may not have to notify the public about a ransomware, but you may have to notify by contract your business partners. And then if they notify the public, then the cat's out of the bag anyway. So keep that in mind. Benchmark IR against peer accepted guidelines like 800-61. In fact, I've seen some IR plans that essentially copy, and which is great, 800-61. So it's a very comprehensive guide to handling incidents. But again, that is just incident response. Breach notification is a separate animal, if you will, and it's all about notifying the right people at the right time. So you have to make sure you have a separate breach notification plan as well. And you should have a mock breach notification document that is just ready to go. Essentially, you've thought it through, you've drafted it, you have some blanks where key information needs to be dropped in, but it's ready to go. It's approved by council, it's approved by PR, it's approved by all the people that you need to approve it. You just have to fill in the relevant data and fire it off. And you don't want to be cranking one of these things out in the midst of dealing with a ransomware and all the issues, especially if the bad guys have also put stuff up on the dark web and have essentially notified the press, etc. Then it becomes a big issue.
And one thing I think would be worth just calling up for the first point is for the breach notification plans, especially if your company operates as a processor of any sorts. It's a really good idea to just have a running document of all of your clients, all of the people that you're handling data for, and who to notify if something goes down, because you don't want to be waiting. You don't want to be digging through for that information. You want to make sure the right authorities are also in that chain if it's different regions. So just including that notification page is also a big recommendation we have.
Excellent. Thank you for adding that on. This is really important stuff, folks. I can't tell you how easy it is for things to go south, and not having those plans ready to roll. It's going to be tough. And in fact, I know that in one case when I had to answer it, help answer an RFP, the RFP provider, the requester, wanted a list of all of my company. This is a past employer, wanted a list of all my company's previous breaches and what happened, all the details. Again, I don't know if you'll get that commonly, but that's something you have to think about, because then you have to decide whether you want to share that, how you want to share it, etc. That was kind of a wake-up call for me, just how important this is. Matt, any questions or comments before we start digging into some summary and conclusions?
Yeah, we got an interesting one here.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about the additional steps that an organization needs to have in place with their third-party vendors to meet CCPA or GDPR requirements?
Sure. Really what you want to do is have consensus on the, as I like to say, stuff you've got to do. So creating, and I'll give you an example, under GDPR, we'll just use that as an example because they've done a good job of stuff you got to do, is Article 28 sub 3 gives just a whole laundry list of things that processors, third parties basically, have to do. And they being the EU, requires you to bake that into all your agreements. So they've already done the work for you in the sense they've told you what you need to do. I think it's the same thing here for CCPA, is that you have a list of stuff you got to do that is given to the vendor or the third party, the licensee, and you get consensus on it. And you say, can you do these things within 72 hours? And you just create a laundry list. Often, if not most of the time, there is a DPA, data processing addendum, that is just specific to personal information and says all the things that the vendor needs to be able to do, when they do it, how they notify folks, what they say. So essentially, you're setting that up ahead of time, including standards. When you get notified as a contractor versus a contractee, versus do you do 72 hours? Also, what kind of information do you have to provide? Do you have to give the business that contracted you a first dibs at a press release? All those kind of things. That should all go into the data protection or data processing addendum ahead of time, and get consensus on that. And again, the laundry list you can just pull from GDPR. They've already given it to you as a starting point, and then you can add more things as well. What I would not do is put in things that are really geared for the main contract, like indemnification and all that happy stuff. just keep that completely out of that agreement, make it its own sub-agreement, and it's again, it's an addendum, but it's an important addendum.
Perfect, thank you, sir.
Okay. So I'm gonna go through some summary and conclusions, and again, I really want to get comments as we go through here and additional questions.
Scott, can I stop you before we go into
sure.
that? This just came in, so the hot off the press here. How do you see the criteria for determining when an incident is considered a breach filtered down to security awareness training an organization provides to its employees? I'm sorry, I probably did not read that as clearly as I could, but perhaps you got the gist of it.
Yeah, could you read that one more time? I'm trying to get the big picture here.
Yes, so how do you see the criteria for determining when an incident is considered a breach filtered down to the security awareness training an organization provides to its employees?
Okay, sure. Essentially, disseminating that criteria, I think there's two pieces to it. One is agree on the criteria to begin with, okay, and say these are the gradations. So something becomes an event. Well, we get events all the time. This is an example of an event, or these are multiple examples. This is when it becomes an incident. When we believe that it's more likely than not that the CIA has, confidential integrity or availability has been compromised, not just been called into question, but has been compromised. I use the more likely than it's not standard, and that's what I would recommend folks take a look at. Because that way you don't have to get to the point of saying something's a quote unquote breach. If it's an incident, you already know that trouble is on the horizon potentially. And so in terms of criteria, get consensus on more likely than it's not that you have an incident. And then from there, talk about indicia of something being a breach versus a non-breach. I'll give you a great example of a non-breach. Suppose you find out that a third party you've licensed data to has done all kinds of bad things with it. And you're probably thinking that's Cambridge Analytica. It's exactly the case. Third party had data legally, they just ran away with it and did all kinds of bad things. That's a non-breach event, or a non-breach incident, or a non-breach breach, if you will. It's still a complete compromise of personal data. You still have to notify in principle folks, but because their data has been compromised. So it goes back to determining when something is an incident, and then being able to use that to then determine whether it's gradated into a breach. But either way, being able to notify that, get the right people notified that, hey, we believe in this. For example, you're in the SOC, you say, look, this has, in my view, the bad guys are inside the network. It's automatically an incident. I'm going to notify whoever, my boss, the legal team, whatever it is. But you at least want to have that threshold. And have a minimum threshold that everyone, when they're being trained, knows that's the threshold. If you have nothing else but that, at least you've notified the right people when something does become an incident. That's a long way of saying that, so I'm sorry.
No, that was great, Scott, and I think it's going to be an interesting exercise for the folks here thinking about when something is going to qualify as an incident. So thank you.
Yes. Okay, so summary conclusions. Some things I want to share with you guys, and definitely want to get your comments here. So the vast majority of fines or verdicts or settlements that I read, so that could be here from the FTC or from case settlements, could be from the GDPR. There's lots of those. The vast majority of them are from data protection 101 failures, not esoteric things like APT or state actors or what have you. So whenever someone's blaming the GRU or the Chinese hackers, whatever, you have to be very suspect, because frankly, most of the failings I see are things that just basic criminals, your garden variety criminal, can exploit, or just people that are just making mischief can exploit. The Ring doorbell being a good example of that. So really have to go back to data protection 101 as where you want to focus on, not on state actors or things of that nature. Secondly, the NIST privacy framework is really almost certainly the best place to start. I really think very highly of it. And in fact, I wrote a paper just on the NIST privacy framework. I'm happy to share it with you guys if you want. But what's important about it is that NIST really took all of the great stuff that you love about the cybersecurity framework and just really turned it into a privacy framework. So Highly recommend that. I like it a lot. Great place to start. Also, if you're at an ISO shop, so you're already started on 27701, 27701 is really nice. I like it a lot. I just think there's a lot to like about it, but it presumes you already have a 001 certification or you're going down the road. Other security standards and frameworks like 001 or NIST 800-171 or the top 20, they're great for addressing InfoSec specific things. So under CCPA and now CPRA, you have that section 150 or InfoSec section. That's a great way to address that section. It can't help you with the entire law, but it can do a lot for that particular section. Same thing for Article 32 of the GDPR. That's essentially the same kind of section. And really anything in a contract or in a statute that requires technical and organizational controls, sometimes they'll say physical and technical administrative, but it's the same idea. Whenever you got that, those standards, guidelines, etc., really will go a long way. So a lot to be said for them. Business partners, and this goes back to a question we had a little bit ago, they really require vigorous policing. I know you've heard it before that your business partners are the weakest link in the chain. They will always be. There's just too many ways that things can go wrong. So they really require vigorous policing, and certainly in the contracts, you have to hold them accountable for everything that they're going to be doing with the personal data that you're entrusting them with. Also, there's this idea of a privacy operations center. Many of you have SOCs, so you're already well versed with a security operations center. But in my experience, I think the time has come, especially if you're a business to consumer organization, for a privacy operations center, for just one center place where all of your privacy operations are managed. Just because it's too easy to lose things, it's too easy to not have accountability. You don't want to have this spread among a couple different people, one person in security, one person in compliance, one person in legal. It's not going to work. I can tell you that from experience. So highly recommend thinking about a privacy operations center. It may be one person. Okay, I was a one-person privacy operations center way back when, and eventually that would have become an entire department. But right now, it was just, at that point, it was just one person. I think it definitely could become an entire department. And then finally, understanding where personal information is located within your environment and who has access to it is key. And see, here's the issue is that in many cases, we don't know where personal information is in our environment. I've seen it in person, by the way, where you have these projects that you do, and then the project manager leaves and the project dies. And so you've got all of this personal data on a server somewhere, and you have no idea, no one has any idea it's there until the bad guys break in and they find it. Bad guys are very good at finding personal data. We should all be at least as good as they are. And so as a consequence, really understanding where that information is, do you need it anymore? Get rid of it if you don't, and who has access to it? It may be that way too many people have access to personal information that just don't. And the fewer people that have it, the better. Same thing at vendors. If they've got access, maybe they're a licensee, who has access there, and do they really need it? And are they making unnecessary copies? Are they floating around on some file server somewhere? Or are the bad guys getting access to it? So those are my summary and conclusions. Comments or questions from the audience before I give a few predictions for 2021.
Yeah, the circuit board here is having a meltdown. We're seeing a lot of interest in the paper you mentioned about NIST and the privacy framework. So we'll definitely want to make that available.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You spoke a little bit about establishing a privacy operations center. The question is, who should be driving GDPR and CCPA compliance and that privacy operations center? Who should be the driving force behind that? Should it be legal, IT, both?
It depends. Well, it can't be both, but you should pick someone that's germane to your business. And I'll give you a great example. If you're a technology company, okay, you probably want someone on the technology side of the house. That may be the CTO's office. That may be someone in IT who specializes in personal data protection. They should be running it. There's some companies that are very process oriented. Maybe they're a consulting firm or something. Probably want to have legal do it or have compliance do it. It's going to be germane to the nature of your business. Don't give it to someone whose role is just not naturally attuned to being a privacy operations center. So every company, I don't want to say it's going to be unique, but every industry is going to have its own department or own person that's really geared for that role. So one size will not fit all. You have to find that person or that department.
Okay, great. Now, can you talk a little bit about high trust? This may not be your exact area of expertise, but the compliance, the high trust framework, to what extent does those requirements address CCPA?
The short answer is I don't know, because I know high trust is focused on healthcare, and HIPAA controlled data is essentially excluded from CCPA. So I can't speak well on high trust. I do know that I don't think there's much of an overlap between those two regimes. So certainly, yeah, that's as much as I can offer on that one.
Okay, no problem at all. Happy to take that question offline with our healthcare team, or Doriel, if you'd like to comment here.
Well, I was just going to say, again, that's also not my area of expertise. I've just worked with various surface level high trust before. But the privacy section of high trust doesn't so much map well to, say, any regulation. It maps better to other privacy frameworks like ISO or the NIST privacy framework. So I think if the question is looking at saying like we're meeting all the high trust privacy requirements, does that put us in a good place for CCPA? There's definitely a few more things to consider specific to CCPA, but it's also a great start. So
good deal.
Awesome.
And finally here, and I know this is kind of a big subject, but what about B2B businesses under CCPA?
B2B businesses under CCPA and under CPRA are largely exempt. So that's the good news. And I don't want to use the words exempt because I don't want people running around and going, oh, we're B2B, we're exempt. But what you're finding is that because of CPRA now, essentially business to business communications, like if you're doing, market research or your, inquiries or things that really your employees are up to, none of that information is going to be subject to CCPA or CPRA. Okay, and employee data is not subject to either, in contrast to GDPR, where basically everything's on the table. So there's not a huge exposure to CCPA. Typically, it's in marketing information. And same thing for CPRA, it's typically marketing information and marketing programs. They're going to be your biggest issue for either of those laws if you're a B2B.
Hey, I had a couple of comments I just wanted to make on the summary. Then I actually had a question for you as well, if that works. So the main thing I wanted to just kind of piggy off of what you said, talking about the frameworks with all the privacy frameworks I've had to work with for clients. The NIST privacy framework is definitely the most valuable for the main reason that it's good at defining privacy risks in your organization. So it's not just about building out your privacy program. It's very valuable in what do you need to do to identify privacy risks in your business processes. And that's something that I think gets left out of a lot of risk assessments that we see that even include privacy. And going back to the other frameworks, to ISO 27701 or 2718 or anything, the great benefit of these is that your organization probably already needs to be adopting some security standard for whatever compliance, whatever other legal requirements you might have. The good thing is that, say, NIST or ISO or CSC, the privacy frameworks kind of function as addendums to the original framework. So if you're seeking 27701 certification, for example, or 2718 certification, we typically will do those like joint with 2701, and it'll be maybe like an extra day of auditing, because most of the controls in the privacy framework are actually deferred to the original security framework. So so just to say that it's not as imposing as it seems. It really might just come down to a bunch of additional controls and a lot of security that you're already doing. And I just wanted a quick question for you. I know that for you, Scott, I know that a lot of the cases that you posted, something that's good to consider, I think, for everyone is not just that we're not just talking about CCPA violations. A lot of these cases had other laws brought in, like unfair competition or Consumer Legal Remedies Act, for example. I also wanted to ask you if you could foresee the California Constitution, which guarantees a right to privacy, if you could foresee that being used in any CCPA lawsuits.
The short answer is no. I have yet to see it used in any CCPA lawsuits. I think largely because it's too easy just to use unfair competition, as you cited earlier. Unfair competition is just such a low bar that why not use it? So I think that's the issue. The other issue too is that when you take statutory damages for CCPA, then the Constitution, at least not per se, doesn't come into play. So you just go for statutory damages and you're done. So it's just not a place you need to go to. And as a lawyer, you always want to find the easiest argument to make. And certainly either statutory damages or just saying something's unfair, that's a low bar to clear.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know we're at the top of the hour. I know we've run over a minute or two, but I do want to give you time to close things out.
Yeah, appreciate that. We are in extra innings here, so I'll just wrap things up pretty quickly. Before I do that, however, I just wanted to share one comment that came in from the audience. This is easily one of the best sessions I've ever attended. Exceptional. I thought that was
thank you.
Back.
Thank you. That just made my day.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, the webinar here is being recorded. So if you want to share with anybody on your team, we'll be happy to send over a link. And happy to address additional questions at that time as well. I also want to take a moment and invite you all to Tevora's upcoming webinar, HITRUST 1 Guide to Certification. This will be on December 1st at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. So please be on the lookout for that invitation in your email, or if you don't receive it, let us know and we'll make sure to get it over to you. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. Really, really appreciate all of the great questions. Again, if there are any additional questions or if you'd like to learn more about the California Consumer Privacy Act, don't hesitate to reach out to us here at Tevora or to Scott. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thanks again.